Yonkers Spotlight. I'm your host, N.Y.S.
And I'm Suchow. Today we have a very special guest with us, Michael Sussman, who's a long-standing human rights lawyer that single-handedly changed the history of the city of Yonkers, but more importantly, of the United States. He was a 1978 honors graduate of Harvard Law School, and he has been one of Hudson Valley's most prominent civil rights and trial lawyers since the 1980s, when he helped end racial segregation in Yonkers public schools. He is married to Lee Squire Sussman, who's a lighting designer and longtime leader in the union that represented skilled workers in the entertainment industry. Together they have 7 children. While in law school, Sussman joined the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. He litigated major school segregation cases throughout the United States, in Cleveland, South Carolina, and Michigan. He later represented the Yonkers branch of the NAACP and litigated an agreement with New York State that provided Yonkers $300 million, which is $250 million, to eliminate traces of segregation in Yonkers public schools.
That is amazing. And he also negotiated housing discrimination claims, gaining $100 million from HUD, Yonkers, New York State for excessive programs that integrate white neighborhoods into Yonkers. He founded a small law firm with his father that started in the building right next to Yonkers, right next to City Hall. That was incredible. I didn't even know that. I worked for quite some time. That was impressive. He also brought hundreds of cases for victims of racial, gender, and national origin discrimination in employment and police brutality, and we all know that that's very well needed. Sussman also is known for his major legal victories, including $6 million settlement that he attained for the family of D.J. Henry, who was the person that was murdered, unfortunately, at Pace University, shot to death by Pleasantville police officers. And that was a huge case, actually. That was pretty impressive. And from 2006 to 2010, Sussman represented a class of 4,700 African Americans and Hispanic state workers, which ended in a $45 million settlement. Wow. Well, that's a lot of money going around, man. Whoa! Wow. He pioneered work in special education, national law representing disabled children. He founded environmental protection, sexual harassment, gender discrimination, and senior citizen care. Please help me welcome Michael Sussman. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you
Yes,
here.
and I just want to personally thank you for all that you did in the city of Yonkers, because my generation specifically benefited from all the money that you've brought to Yonkers. So thank you.
Thank you both, and I'm really delighted to be here. The reason I'm here, though, has nothing to do directly with any of that. It's because in 2017, I was thinking about running for county executive of my county, which is Orange County, a few counties northwest of here. And I realized that to do that, I was a Democrat, I'd have to run basically with Andrew Cuomo. And I looked around the state and I saw profound corruption in the state. I saw what I thought was a duopoly of corruption between the 2 major political parties. I thought that one washed the other's back, essentially, and that nobody was really serious about creating a politics in the state, a legal regime in the state, which would rid us of that. So I didn't run for county executive in 2017, much to my wife's enjoyment. She didn't want me to run. And in 2018, when Mr. Schneiderman had to leave the Office of Attorney General and that position came open, I thought I would try to devote the 40 years you mentioned. I don't feel that old. I look that old, but I don't feel that old. To the people of the state, I've always done what's called public law, which is law in the public interest. But I have run only once for an office outside of my own town, which was county executive in 2001. I did beat the Democrats, the regular Democrats in that primary. I was the insurgent. But then 9/11 happened, and it was a very conservatizing event. But since then, I haven't run for public office. I've never run for statewide office. And I felt that really this was the time. Both of these political parties, honestly, when you look at them in an objective way, have not served the interests of our state. And when I look at the interests of our state, what I, of course, care most about are minority citizens. And the reason I care most about minority citizens is because from my point of view, they've been the brunt of very systemic discrimination. And I think it's the government's primary responsibility to remedy that. I don't think we can sit idly by and simply say generation after generation is going to be the same, because it's not fair to individual people. It's not fair to their children.
Right.
There's not equal educational opportunity in our state, or equal housing opportunity, or equal employment opportunity. We have to work to make that happen. And the Attorney General's office is a place where that can happen. So that gives you some real background of why I'm trying to do this. I realize the Green Party is not a household word to many people. They feel the Democrats, the Democrats, the Democrats. But when you look at it, I don't feel the Democratic Party has delivered. And we can talk about that in greater detail, but that's a real concern of mine.
Well, I definitely share some of your sentiments for sure, but I'd like to start at the beginning.
Okay, sure.
Who is Michael Sussman, and how did he get involved with this? Like, what is the person that's inside of you that made you want to say, I want to stand up for human rights? How did that come about?
Well, London, truthfully, that's been a thing since I was about 5 years old. Something that I've never not been conscious of as a central part of my being. We each have different values. We each grew up differently. My parents, my father was in the 50s, a garment industry executive, and he was desegregating plants in the South, which at that time when you went down there, African American people were allowed to sweep in plants. That was about the only thing they were allowed to do. They weren't allowed even to be in the production process. And my father and others went and realized that was wrong. You know, I remember my father when I was 5 and 6 years old coming back from the South with cotton and saying to me, it's just as bad up here.
Wow.
And I came to understand that growing up in Brooklyn. I came to understand that we would live in a segregated environment from people of color. And the conditions were obviously not equal. I would drive to neighborhoods with my parents and see the conditions in those neighborhoods and be abhorred by it, upset by it. I felt that even though it wasn't true, my parents were middle-class people, they weren't rich people. I didn't have every advantage in a certain sense, but comparatively I did have every advantage. And I realized that for me, what was important wasn't self-aggrandizement, wasn't accumulating wealth. It really didn't have meaning to me, because I realized that in a society with such a high degree of inequality, to achieve a huge amount of wealth and basically be on the backs of other people. That's how I felt about it. And that's how I've always felt about it.
So you went to Harvard Law School and you graduated with honors. Why did you specifically, I guess it was a part of, you know, what you had to do in law school, but why did you specifically go to Washington, D.C.?
It wasn't part at all. What happens at Harvard is that there's a lot of interest in Harvard Law School graduates. Obviously, it's one of the premier law schools in the country, and
Right.
we have economic opportunities, job opportunities. The only job I wanted out of law school was to be in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. And I didn't realize, this is a funny story, that it was competitive. I mean, I didn't realize how competitive. I really didn't. And I applied to maybe 3 jobs. One legal services in Southwest Texas, one in Eastern Tennessee, and the Justice Department. And I got the Justice Department job and was thrilled and thought very little of it. And then when I got to Washington, they told me that 37 people from Harvard Law School had applied and they took 2.
Oh.
And I said, oh my God, I felt an amazing sense of relief. I don't know why they took me, but I was happy they did.
Oh.
And that was the beginning really of my career in October of 1978. And I went there and I was part of the education section, which was really developing the theory that we eventually used in Yonkers, which was that segregation is not a natural condition, number one. And number two, housing segregation breeds school segregation. The innovation of the Yonkers case was linking housing and school segregation, which, believe it or not, had legally never been linked before. So all the lawsuits are about school segregation, suing school districts. We thought, no, the housing patterns that were intentionally created to segregate minorities from majority were creating school segregation.
Right.
And it was intentionally done.
Wow.
And Yonkers presented that tremendously, unfortunately, tragically. But the history of Yonkers was that housing segregation was in part being fostered so that children wouldn't go to integrated schools. And that was said at meetings. We don't want our kids together. So how do you keep the kids apart? You continue to segregate people.
Wow, that's interesting. So we have to take a quick break, but please don't go anywhere. We'll be right back more with world famous Michael Sussman.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Yonkers Spotlight. We have our special guest with us, Michael Sussman, and we're going to be talking a little bit about his history growing up and involved in civil rights. So most people think, Michael, that Yonkers was your first big, legal case, but you've actually been involved in many cases throughout the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Well, one of the interesting issues for me has been gerrymandering and creating districts that, first of all, excluded minorities, and then, of course, gerrymandering on a partisan basis as well as a racial basis. So in 1980, before Yonkers, 1981, 82, that period, when I went to the NAACP from the Justice Department, I worked on a case in Virginia where we were able to really shift political power in that state by challenging the gerrymandered state Senate and get much more minority representation. In Indiana, I did a statewide case, which was the first case that established partisan gerrymandering as unconstitutional, which is now a big issue, but that was in 1983, 84, 85. I was working on that case.
So wait a minute, I just want to make sure I understand this. You're blowing my mind right now. Because we're just getting to the gerrymandering thing maybe 5, 10 years ago, right? Before the Democrats woke up and said, oh my God, what happened? You were working on this in the early 80s?
Well, in Yonkers, I don't know if you know this, I brought a case to get minorities onto the city council and in the county legislature.
Yes.
There was no minority ever in the Yonkers City Council till we brought litigation in federal court challenging 1984 and 5.
Wait, so I'm going to make sure I understand this, because I think I'm hearing you right. You're saying in 1984, 85, there was not one single person of color elected or appointed.
That is correct. Elected is what we're talking about. We're talking about the Yonkers City Council and the Westchester County Legislature. That changed in the 80s because we brought lawsuits in the mid-80s against both the City Council, the city, and Westchester County. That's how Herman Keith's seat, which was the county seat from right here where we are, and the seat that Ernie Davis eventually got in Mount Vernon, that's how those seats came to pass. So let me just say this, when I looked at Yonkers in the early 80s, and we're going back now more than 35 years, 37 years, what I saw was a consciousness of racism against people of color, both African American and Latino. That consciousness spread across all areas of social life. It spread across education, housing, employment, police, municipal employment, voting. It wasn't confined to one area. So to fight that level of racism, I had to bring lawsuits in all those areas. And I did. So the most prominent case is the school housing case, because people know about that. It lasted 26 years, and as you mentioned earlier, a lot of money got involved and a lot of change. But there were many other cases we had to bring to deal with the same consciousness. My interest is in dealing with the consciousness of racism, because it takes a myriad of forms. You understand what I'm saying? But the consciousness that is at the root of all of those forms is what has to be dealt with. And my view of how you deal with that is through truth-telling. Remember the Yonkers trial, the major case, we had a 92-day trial. That followed depositions of over 140 witnesses. There were about 14,000 documents tracing 40 years of social and racial history in the city. The purpose of that wasn't only to establish the legal liability of the city and the school district and eventually HUD and eventually the state, all of whom were responsible, but it was to go through what really was a truth-telling exercise so that people understood this just didn't happen. It didn't just happen. It happened because of people's conscious choices. There were sites starting in the 1930s and 40s that were being looked at for housing that would not have led to the segregated housing you have in Yonkers. But those sites were uniformly rejected for 40 years, creating the condition of segregation.
Wow.
So this is a deep and rich history, and it didn't just happen.
Right. And you were, at the forefront of Who were, the players that were involved with you on these cases?
And who helped influence you on top of that?
Those are very different questions,
Yeah.
but the first question, which I'll answer first, is the people in Yonkers. I've always said, whether I work on civil rights cases, environmental cases, cases involving any other form of injustice, that the law is not a separate institution. I remember we talked about this with Fred Hernandez's situation in Yonkers. The law is both responsive and responds to and shapes, but is also shaped by movements. They're not independent of each other. And this is an important lesson that we all have to learn. So many movements have been dissipated and dissolved because those people involved got into court, and then the momentum of the movement shifted and dissipated, disappeared. Oh, we're in court now. Well, what's there for me to do? So in Yonkers particularly, I always felt very strongly, given the magnitude of this case, that we needed a strong, at that point, NAACP, which was the major organization. Now, of interest here is that there was no comparable Hispanic organization, a Latino organization, in the 1980s in Yonkers. One of my great frustrations, actually, was finding the leadership of the Latino community, which I represented. I represented African Americans and Latinos. It was a class.
Right.
It was a class of some 35,000 people. But finding the leadership in that community was very difficult for me. The NAACP was more obvious. Herman Keith, Winston Ross, Reverend Grady, Reverend George at point in time. And there were others. Ken Jenkins emerged, Liz Hemingway, Karen Edmondson, Diane Pearson. I mean, these were people I worked with. But I mostly attended the branch meetings, reported to the branch. But finding the analog for that in the Hispanic community then was very difficult. In terms of influences, I view this as a cumulative struggle. I view my work as a continuation of the work of giants. Giants. I mean, Thurgood Marshall, giants. Constance Baker Motley, giant. William Taylor, Thomas Atkins. Many people inspired me, but I realized that we were working on their platform. It doesn't just start. The Yonkers case was made possible legally, doctrinally, because of what others had done. And I just tried to take it a step further, if you will, and apply their teachings here. So there are a lot of people, but the main thing is trying to be true to yourself, and I've tried to do that in these cases, to litigate them honestly and to litigate them in light of the people's wishes and needs.
Well, it seems to me that this is your life work. And when I see the work that you've accumulated and partaken in, it seems to me that you might be a little overqualified for this position here. So,
well, the Attorney General of New York is the highest law enforcement official in a state of 17 or 18 million people. So I don't think I'm any way overqualified. I do think that it's important, though, to understand that this is a position that people can run for in a way, whatever their qualifications are, whatever their history is. And for some, it's been a political stepping stone, as you know. We've had Mr. Spitzer, we've had Mr. Cuomo, and historically in New York, the Attorney General's position is seen as a stepping stone. I'm too old for that. So there's no stepping stone for me. I see the Attorney General's position as very different, and we can talk about that. But it's not, for me, this may sound strange, particularly political. I'm trying to get people of all political parties to put aside party and realize that what we need is an independent Attorney General. What does that mean? It means someone who's not going to be controlled by the major political parties and can spend his or her time focusing on the needs of the people, the legal needs of the people. It's not everything. It's not all policy. It's not being the legislator. It's not being the governor. But there's a huge legal agenda. Again, we can discuss the details of that. But for me, that's what's attractive about this position. I don't feel overqualified. I feel qualified.
Humble man, but we got to take a quick break, unfortunately. So please don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. More with the world famous, the one and only, Mr. Sussman.